Welcome to part 2 of our study of the American Revolution. This time we're going to be talking about major causes of the Revolutionary War. So, grab that spiral, get out a pencil. We're going to make a list. I got eggs, bacon. Wait, this is my shopping list. Causes of the Revolutionary War. Well, we talked about one of them already. In our last video, we talked about the French-Indian War and how it led to taxation, which would be a major reason why the colonists would declare their independence. So let's take a look at some of these taxes. The first one was called the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act put a tax on newspapers, almanacs, wedding licenses, and other printed materials. The Stamp Act angered the colonists for a couple reasons. First of all, colonists were used to governing themselves. They paid taxes to their colonial governments, who then paid for roads, jails, and other needs of the colony. They didn't feel that suddenly they should be paying more taxes to a king thousands of miles away. The second reason, and most important reason, is they had no say in whether they should pay the tax. This was a big deal because of a long-standing agreement between the king and the ruled in Britain called the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was signed by King John in 1215. King John was forced by the noble lords of the time to sign the agreement because the king had been abusing his power. The Magna Carta required the king to get permission of the nobles before collecting taxes. Before the Magna Carta, if the king wanted money, he simply raised taxes and sent the nobles to their manors to collect them. The king was shielded from seeing the results of his tax collection, but the nobles were not, and tired of doing the king's dirty work. Eventually, the king's nobles would turn into Parliament, which was a system where noblemen represented the different parts of the country. The colonies didn't have any noble representation in Parliament, and therefore were not asked permission before being taxed. This was the number one cause of the Revolution, as Great Britain would never give colonists representation in Parliament or take away all taxation. Sometimes anger over taxes led to violence, like the Boston Massacre. British soldiers were stationed in Boston to make sure taxes were collected. This didn't sit well with many Bostonians, who didn't like armed soldiers walking around the town. Some townsfolk decided they would harass the soldiers. They started name-calling and hurling insults, which turned into snowballs and rock-throwing, and soon citizens in the crowd had sticks, knives, clubs, and other weapons. They dared the soldiers to fire and made them fear for their lives. Eventually the soldiers would fire into the crowd, killing 3 instantly, and as the fighting broke out, soldiers would continue to fire. In the end, 12 people would die, all of them members of the mob, none of them soldiers. The colonists went right to work, turning this event into hatred of the king. They came up with the name the Boston Massacre. But was it? First of all, let's define massacre. A massacre is the killing of a large number of innocent people. In a crowd of hundreds, even though every human life is precious, I'm not sure 12 is a large number. And these victims were not necessarily innocent if they had weapons and were abusing the soldiers. The name stuck, however, and was used to convince colonists that they should fight and join the cause of the rebellion. The soldiers who fired into the crowd would be put on trial and defended by future President John Adams. All but 3 of these soldiers would be released with no jail time. The other soldiers would be found guilty of manslaughter. Another tax the colonists would object to would be the tax on tea. Again, this was a tax put on the colonists without their permission, and one that was wildly unpopular. This was not about the money, as the tax was very low. Instead, it was about control and power. One way that colonists revolted against taxes was through boycotts. A boycott is when a group of people refuse to buy something in order to make a change. Instead of getting all the colonists to refuse to buy tea, it was easier to get the merchants or store owners not to buy the tea from Britain. If the tea wasn't in the store, people couldn't buy it. This left the British East India Company with a lot of tea in Boston and no merchant willing to buy it. Parliament came up with an idea. They decided with the Tea Act to put a low tax on tea and then allow the British East India Company to set up stores and sell directly to the colonists, skipping the merchants. When a group called the Sons of Liberty heard about this, they knew they needed to do something. The Sons of Liberty were a group of patriots who were fighting to stop taxes and control of the king. Boycotts were an important tool for the colonists, and this new law would take that power away. In response, the Sons of Liberty decided they would make sure the tea was never sold to anyone. On December 16, 1773, the Sons of Liberty, dressed up like Mohawk Indians, walked onto the ships in Boston Harbor, and they threw the tea into the water. This was successful in keeping the tea from being sold and taxed. However, the king would not accept such open defiance without a response. So what? If you can answer the following questions, then you'll learn what you needed to know. Why were the colonists so upset about the Stamp Act and other taxes? What caused the Boston Massacre, and how was it used by the Patriots? And finally, what was the Tea Act, and how did the Sons of Liberty deal with it? Stay tuned next time when we find out what the king did in response to the Boston Tea Party.